I want to speak about the individual and what it takes for an individual to flourish, how we understand the human person. I also want us to engage context. The church, structures, but then I want to start to also for us to engage culture. And I want to start with culture first. There are a lot of cultural narratives about flourishing. Lots of different cultural understandings in the culture about what it takes for a person to flourish. And sometimes these cultural narratives are very much rooted in communities to which we belong. Whether it's an African American community, a Hispanic community, an evangelical community, right? Whatever the community may be, each of these communities have competing claims about what it means to flourish. How do we wrestle with that today? In your mind, what are the narratives out there, or the views of the human person advanced by these narratives that we should rethink with moral discernment, that perhaps are not contributing to flourishing, that perhaps are giving us things that we may like, but actually bring our demise, not our flourishing? How should we tackle that cultural narrative, or those cultural narratives? Ian, please.
So it's a powerful and I think very timely question, because in the world I live in, I run schools in the heart of the South Bronx, where in the school that we just opened, only 7% of kids who start ninth grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college. So for generations, kids are growing up in environments where the narratives that they hear is that the system is rigged against you, or that there are all these obstacles that are designed for your failure. And what I've observed is that there are really two dominant narratives. One I call blame the system, and the other I call blame the victim. In the blame the system narrative, that's an ideology that views our country, that views America itself as an oppressive nation. That's simply based on your skin color, your race, your gender, some immutable characteristic, that you are a victim, that you are somehow behind the eight ball, that there is a white supremacist lurking on every corner, that capitalism itself is evil, and that these systems are so powerful, so rigged, so destructive that you as an individual are powerless to overcome them. Right? So that obviously is a narrative that robs young people of the type of agency that I described earlier. But on the other side, there's what I call blame the victim. In that narrative, it's not America that's the problem. America's the land of opportunity. No, you're the problem. You as an individual, you haven't pulled yourself up by your own bootstraps. You haven't taken advantage of all the opportunities that exist out there. Of course, the problem with that narrative is that it's really hard if you're 8 years old to pull yourself up by the bootstraps if you're in a district where only 7% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, or you're not part of a strong faith community, or if you've been raised in a struggling family. So I have felt we have to have an empowering alternative for young people to recognize that they're not alone. Agency is individually practiced, but socially empowered. So what are the core institutions, and I keep coming back to family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. We need a revitalization of those institutions so that more young people can recognize they are not alone. They are not alone. And too often I think in our society there is this expectation that in order to be successful, you've got to go out and just go do it, the Horatio Alger story. And we forget the key institutions that can help all of our young people succeed.
Thank you. Dr. Wolf or Pastor Rodriguez?
Sure. This is such a large question that we could discuss and kind of tease out various aspects. And I think each of us will have a kind of certain slant on it. I just want to emphasize one thing that became significant for me over the period of maybe last 5 years or so. No, maybe a little bit longer, but 9. And that's, I was reflecting about the nature of American higher education and how in American higher education, the question of meaning of life has gradually shifted to the margins so that generally our institutions of higher education do not grapple with that question more generally. And then I was asking myself, why is that when this question of what is the life worth living? What is the meaning of our lives was at the very heart of higher education, Harvard University, other universities, Yale as well, and throughout, all the way through the, even up to the 60s. And then suddenly it fell off. And one could see that universities became about how do I acquire means to achieve certain goals. That was the larger question of prevalence of thinking about what do I need to have to set the goals, because I don't really know what the goal of my life is, so that follow your dream and have all the resources available for you so that whatever your dream becomes next time, that's where you can go because you would have enough resources. That means that we, from the kindergarten on, through the university education, started thinking about how do I acquire certain forms of capital. Monetary capital, educational capital, reputational capital, all sorts of kind of capitals which then I could employ in whatever ways I can. And suddenly we knew how to get from point A to point B because we learn business, we learn technology, we learn politics, and so forth. The only thing we didn't know is what point of B is worth reaching. So we have our desires, and we have means to acquire what we desire. You mentioned that in introductory comments, but we just are not sure what it is that's worth wanting and why is it worth wanting. And that question depends on answering the question, what kind of human being is it worth being? Who are we as human beings? What should we strive for? You have a famous course in Stanford on design your life, right? I've talked to the authors of that book. They spent 3 pages on asking the question, what are you designing your life for? And about 250, I'm not sure how big the book is, 300 maybe, on how do you design it? My question is, and our question is, I think Christian question is, I'll put it this way, is to what end do we live our lives? And then to line up the means that we need to have in order to lead those kinds of lives. I've started teaching courses at Yale's that address just that kind of a question, and I think we need churches, we need institutions who would take up those questions. My last comment, I sometimes think the churches think in the means kind of way only and not in the ends kind of way. The Lord is then only a savior. The Lord is then only a comforter. The Lord is then only the one who blesses. But the Lord is not, well, the Lord. Not the one who sets the agenda for our lives.
Thank you. Pastor.
Respectfully, and this is just Sam Rodriguez coming from, of course, my perspective, my worldview, but even the notion that culture has some sort of positive inclination or commitment for flourishing may be debatable. I would argue right now, culture, outside the context of our Christian biblical worldview, would have great angst and consternation regarding even the subject matter of flourishing. There is a perpetual survival modality. The narratives embedded in culture right now do not speak to or even advance the notion of flourishing. I would argue it advances this idea of permanent dependency. Dependency on government replacing God. I have stated frequently, and I do believe it, that we have this obsession about Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam may be our uncle, he will never be our Heavenly Father. And don't forget, our uncles get drunk. And our uncles are kind of weird on occasion, right? But this uber dependency on the state, the government, the hierarchy, the bureaucracy, it's for survival mode. I don't think any government has the intention of putting their citizenry in some sort of failure reality, but it's about survival so you can depend on us, hence we retain our power. The Christian message is so antithetical because the message of Christ, John 10:10, which could undergird to a great degree, the enemy came to rob, kill, and destroy, but I, Jesus said, came to give you life and life abundantly. Again, in the Greek exegete, that abundant life description equates to flourishing in him. Now, I'm not referencing some sort of prosperity gospel embedded in the charismatic circle. I'm talking about flourishing, prospering in him. Abundant life, what does that look like? Through academia, through taking urban contexts and removing the lids, be it educational, social, economic, for families to have a multi-generational legacy of effectiveness, of flourishing, of prosperity. But in the Christian worldview, it begins with understanding that there are narratives out there that are counterintuitive to us experiencing abundant life. Perpetual victimization. We as a church are called to preach against this idea that we are perpetual victims. And all we're hearing continuously in culture is, you're a victim, I'm a victim. We speak more about the trauma than the testimony. And everyone is a victim. I can be a victim. I went to Starbucks, they didn't have almond milk. That's victimization right there. I mean, everyone's a victim. And we're creating a culture of, and this is gonna be coarse, you may wanna edit this post facto, of just multi-generational whiners. And it's trauma negating the testimony. Not that we don't have empathy regarding legitimate trauma, but there's this wonderful thing called redemption. Hence the problem with wokeism and the cancel culture. There's no element of redemption. We negate the vicarious atoning finished work of Christ. 1, today's complacency is tomorrow's captivity. Today, I remind myself, Samuel Rodriguez, por favor, no te olvides de lo siguiente. I did not speak in tongues for the Pentecostal community. I just want to say I was not speaking in tongues.
Waiting for interpretation.
And by the way, it was beautiful Spanish, by the way.
All the charismatics going, like, praise be the Lord. It's not that, it's not. Today's complacency is tomorrow's captivity. Number 2, we are what we tolerate. We are what we tolerate in our homes, in our families, in our generation, in Michigan, in America. In the 21st century, we are what we tolerate. Number 3, there is no such animal as comfortable Christianity. Number 4, truth must never be sacrificed on the altar of political or cultural expediency. And number 5, we must reconcile our eschatology with our missiology. This idea of, it doesn't matter what happens to the world, we don't need to flourish. Jesus is coming, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, so who cares? We must push back on that. While we all believe that Jesus is coming down, while we wait for Jesus to come down, Jesus is waiting for his church to stand up. So we have to reconcile our eschatology with our missiology and flourish, and that's how we change the world.
Thank you. So I want to speak about context. Because all of you have touched on the important role of institutions, right? There are many narratives who advance flourishing, but they're not. Dependency, victimization, so many. And a Christ-centered worldview, truly Christ-centered, Christ-rooted, really is the answer. It provides the guide, the parameters, the foundations of flourishing, a flourishing life. I want to speak about context, though, in institutions. Academia, K-12 education, the church. These are vital institutions. And we can speak about the family later on as well, because it's vital to all of us. But there is a significant crisis in these institutions. In the church, you've already mentioned it already, Dr. Wolf. In academia and higher education, even in Christian higher education. But these institutions are vital. The church is vital. Universities are vital. K-12 education, vital. So would you please address, we know the importance of the institutions, but what has to be transformed in these institutions for them to really advance a perspective, philosophy, curriculum about flourishing, which seems to me to be very much intertwined with the nature of the human person?
Well, for me, the only way that I can answer that question after struggling with what the crisis is, particularly in K-12 education, was to run my own schools. We have to have the courage to build the institutions that stand for the principles that we believe in. So we've launched a school that's organized around the 4 cardinal virtues of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. Everything in our school, the curriculum, our rituals, our practices are tied back to these 4 cardinal virtues. Today, our team eliminated our cell phone policy for our students. Originally, we allowed the students to be able to carry their cell phones, and that didn't work. And so we've said, now when you come to school, you have to park your cell phone, and you'll get it at the end of the day. But it wasn't just a random thing. We said that this is organized around the virtue of temperance and self-regulation and self-control, because you have to have the ability to not grab this device. And it seems like a simple example, but the more and more we operationalize what it means to have the habits and virtues of what flourishing means, this is what I often see as the disconnect. We say wonderful words like flourishing or agency or self-determination, but we have a rising generation that doesn't actually know what those words actually mean or how you develop the tools, the habits of mind to adopt those practices. And so for me, running institutions has to become the vehicle through which we prove that our theories actually work. And the one thing that's, I think, positive around what has happened over the last few years, post-COVID closures, many families, particularly in K-12 education, saw that their schools were not acting necessarily in the best interests of their kids. They were pushing ideologies that were very opposed to a Christ-centered way of life, and more families are homeschooling. They're taking their education into the lives of into their own hands. And I think that the more and more we create what we call educational freedom, where parents have the right to create the kind of context where they want their children to be educated, that, for me, is how we ultimately break through the oppressive narratives that have held so many of us back.
Dr. Wolf, universities, near and dear to my heart, to your heart, and I've read about some of the courses you teach at Yale on this very important question about a life worth living. So share with us, if you had unlimited resources to build your own university, how would you do it?
Oh, wow. This is absolutely a challenging question, partly because I don't consider myself to be really administrator, though I have this great admiration for what folks who are designing and running our great universities are doing. But I think one of the things, and I can think of lots of things that I could do differently, but certainly one of the things that I would do differently is that there was as I indicated earlier, there was this major shift that happens in the humanities subjects. Those humanities subjects have started to emulate hard sciences. And obviously universities have to contain hard sciences element, social sciences element, humanities element. I think theology belongs there too as a normative discipline as well in the Christian kind of context. But humanities, given that in universities, hard sciences have a reputationally are on the top. And everybody kind of tries to emulate the scientific rationality. As a consequence, what we have lost in humanities is ability to converse across century with voices from the past. So that you read Plato, Plato can be interested, you can have antiquarian interest in Plato. What did Plato say and what did it mean then? What were the conditions under which he was saying what he was saying? That's a kind of interesting study in maybe exotic plants, but of relatively little relevance for us today. Whereas in earlier times, humanities were, among other things, also about this large conversation that happens across the centuries. And that was the conversation of what kind of life is worthy of our humanity. How do we construct, how do we see the world and ourselves in the world and live in that way? I've started in response to that. I'm at Yale University, it's a pluralistic university. I've started teaching then, in response to this question, a course that is itself a pluralistic course. And the course is entitled Life Worth Living. And our question is, what kind of life is worthy of our humanity? What does it mean to lead life well, agency? What does it mean for life to go well for us? Circumstances that we need, like every plant needs good soil, so human beings also need circumstances to survive. What does it mean to feel right? What motivations do I have to lead life in this way? What happens when I fail? And to whom I'm responsible? Those are our questions. We ask those questions of the great traditions, religious and secular. And then have what I describe as truth-seeking conversation. Each of these philosophies and religions that we encounter, they make claim to be true. I say to my students, they can't all be true. They can have maybe partially a little bit of truth, but they can't all be true because they contradict each other. But I wanted to take them seriously during 2 weeks that we are engaging this question with the tradition. And then wrestle with those claims with the best possible way so that you can understand and live from within that tradition. You can always reject that tomorrow, but you have to expose yourself so that you can begin to understand and wrestle with the truth that is there. Because what I find very often is kind of dismissal that we have. What we are not familiar with, we dismiss. It's very interesting what happens with the students. We invite them also to go into practices, for instance. I have done it once with my students. Okay, so to understand what Judaism is, you have to understand signature practice of Judaism. Signature practice of Judaism is keeping Sabbath. I'm going to keep Sabbath one day, one Sabbath. I invite all of you to do the same. And then we're going to meet together and discuss what kind of experiences we have had when we have parked our desire, parked our striving, and we have simply been there, celebrated a day that is free. Now, you can be Jewish, and this can be part of your tradition, but you can be a Christian, you can be a non-Christian, and you can suddenly discover what does it mean not just not to have a cell for the time that you are in your school, but what does it mean to be completely free of any responsibility. And I'll end with this. I love that insight that I gained as I was doing this. We live our lives striving and always strive for more. Striving creates malcontentment. That is to say, if I seek to achieve something more, it means that I'm not quite satisfied with what is. And there is a proper malcontentment, right? We should be striving. But what happens when we cannot be content? Not even for a moment. How can you have a flourishing life? How can you have joy
or gratitude,
if there is no contentment? And Sabbath, I have come to believe, is the day of contentment. I love this story. You can see it in Joshua Heschel's book on Sabbath, where a rabbi on the Sabbath day walked in the garden and he was thanking God for everything was created so wonderfully, and then he walks there and he sees his fence was broken. And then he says, immediately thinks, okay, I got called soon as Sabbath's over. I've got to call, so somebody has to come and repair this fence. And then he interrupts himself in the middle of it and said, what am I doing? I am working on this Sabbath. This fence, he concluded, is going to remain unrepaired the rest of my life to remind me that Sabbath is the day of contentment. It's a day of celebration of what is. Final comment on this. In Dante's Divine Comedy, at the beginning in Paradiso, souls have different ranks, right? Different levels. At the beginning, he comes to the very beginning, and then there are these souls that are at the bottom, and there are these souls that are all the way up. And the question immediately is, well, how can you be satisfied in heaven when there are those who are better than you up there? And the response of the soul was absolutely splendid. We long for what we have. Learn how to long for what you have. That's Sabbath. 6 days, you long to have what you long to have. But on the 7th day, long for what you have. All of our relationship to our children, to our work, to ourselves, our predicate depend for their beauty in this sense of, I long, I'm grateful, I rejoice in what I have and who I am.
Pastor Sam, Dr. Wolf before said, Jesus, yes, church, no, that book. Today, the church finds itself in a difficult situation as well. And many, a high number of young people are not attending church for various reasons. Many are recovering from church, so they will say. In your own ministry, tell us about the church, your church, by the institution of the church. What are the kinds of things that need to be done, rethought perhaps, in terms of the flourishing?
I'm a super fan of the church. Self-serving, isn't that statement? Wouldn't that be self-serving? But I am. Like, I truly believe that the Matthew 16:18 principle, the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church of Jesus. The most powerful institution, the only institution guaranteed to never fail. Google, Starbucks, Ford, IBM, Bitcoin, crypto, all of these things, the only one ever guaranteed is the church. The church. We have issues. The number one problem in America is not what you think. It's not moral relativism, cultural decadence. It is ecclesiastical lukewarmness. The number one issue is theological promiscuity. We are promiscuous theologically. The reason why millennials, Generation Z, and Alpha are not attracted to the church, they may very well rewrite the second edition of Jesus Yes, Church No, because we have deviated from biblical orthodoxy, the centrality of Christ, biblical truth. We have become echo chambers of mutual affirmation. And to a great degree, and even we pastor, God bless, a wonderful church, a thriving church, but even the mega church culture to a great degree, the idea of influence being more important than integrity, that's scary. And that lack of viable, sustainable, biblically undergirded balance is the reason why, to a great degree, we're going to hell in a handbasket. And what we need to do is see a church that is committed to biblical orthodoxy, the centrality of Christ, biblical truth. We need to be a church that elevates Psalm 89:14, righteousness, justice, truth, and love. Imagine a church that teaches righteousness, justice, truth, and love. A church that is, now this is going to be a little bit edgy, that is reflective of the current American demographical landscape. Meaning, if you live in a region where the community is multi-ethnic, we need to do away with the idea of a permanent monochromatic depiction of the community. The church needs to be multi-ethnic, reflective of the community. We need to do away with the racial, ethnic, color, pigmentation, division, and discord. And we need to really look like the city and the community we're in. Now, if you're in North Dakota and everyone lacks a tan, then I respect that. You know, it is what it is. But if you live in anywhere where there's diversity in the community, it behooves us to make sure we're planting churches that look like the kingdom of heaven. We need to be careful in becoming political churches. And what I mean by that is I believe in prophetic activism rather than political advocacy. I believe every church should be committed to biblical truth and should espouse biblical truth. And I believe Christians should vote as an extension of our faith. Our vote should coincide with our biblical worldview. And we cannot create a dichotomy, a wall of separation. It should be a continuum. If you're pro-life on Sunday, for the love of God, vote pro-life on Tuesday. There's a continuum there. Whatever it may be, there should be a continuum. With that being said, we shouldn't marry the donkey or the elephant. We should be married exclusively to the Lamb. And we should be people of the Lamb's agenda and do away with the notion of a Republican church and a Democrat church. You know, we are Lamb's agenda people, a lamb who happens to be the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So we can do this, but it requires great intentionality. And if we want to reach the emerging generations, we have to speak to issues that they are hungry for, which is truth, absolute, natural law. What are the moral absolutes that undergird civilization, not just Western society, but just collective civilization and humanity in order for us to flourish? I believe the church is the antidote. We are the answer, but we have to rise up and we have to look within ourselves and have a heart-to-heart, come to Jesus moment and say, for such a time as this, let's address these issues.
Thank you. I want us to dive a little deeper in the context piece, because you mentioned politics, the wonderful book, Lamb's Agenda. And there's a significant move in our society, more and more. There's a counter push too, but a significant argument that somehow all of these problems of flourishing can be solved through better policies, through politics, through political institutions. A significant number even of evangelical Christians also believe that the government is the best means through which to address issues of poverty and education, so on and so forth. That's a significant opinion. Each of you in some ways are arguing something different. Not everyone has the luxury of starting their own school. Praise the Lord, you did. Or starting a brand new university. Some have done it in Texas just this year, as you know, a brand new from scratch. Not everyone can plant a church. So how do we, students in this room, faculty, staff, individuals in the trenches, as it were, what do we need to do when you have these powerful movements of government and big institutions, political ones being the ones that oftentimes are seen as the saviors of the day? And especially when we can't always initiate what I'll call seismic changing kinds of institutions. What do we do?
You know, to some degree, I'll confess, running schools, I thought I can run great schools in the heart of the South Bronx, and I can be a government institution that transforms these issues. And I started running schools in 2010, and over the course of the decade, we had incredible success. We had about 5,000 children on our wait list each year for only about 200 open seats, especially in the South Bronx. And we decided to move our headquarters to the South Bronx because all of our future schools would be there. We would solve many of the issues of poverty and all these things just by building great schools. And when we moved our headquarters to the South Bronx, there was a needle exchange on the corner. There were drug addicts passing by our doors, but these are God's children. This is where we need to build great schools. We decided to do a walking tour of the neighborhood just to get to see where's the local bodega, where's the local deli, just so our staff could acclimate themselves. And we had this epiphany moment where as we walked on this walking tour, we saw about where that back wall is a 27-foot baby blue Winnebago truck. And all of these adults were excited by this truck, almost like kids when they see the ice cream truck. And as we got closer, we saw graffiti lettering, and the lettering said, "Who's your daddy?" And it turned out the "Who's your daddy" truck is a mobile DNA testing center where low-income folks were spending somewhere between $350 and $500 to answer questions like, Could you be my sister? Are you my father? Profound questions about identity. It literally was in that moment, seeing the normalcy of this truck, that I recognized the limitations of policy, or the limitations of even running great schools. Necessary, but not sufficient. I realized that we had to run schools that talk to young people about deeply spiritual matters, about deep questions about who you want to be, what is the family you want to form in your life, regardless of the family that you've come from. So I actually think it's very important, many of us, especially in the policy realm, recognize we could only go so far with policy. And it's much more about the key institutions, particularly the church, where we're building one-on-one relationships. We cannot transform our society from a top-down perspective. And that's what I've come to the conclusion, that great schools policy, sure, things like school choice, if you advocate in your local community, run for school board, there still are policy levers that are important to unleash opportunities for the next generation. But frankly, I think it's much more about the culture that we build. That is really what we as individuals in our society have to come together to do.
Dr. Wolf.
Yeah, I would echo much of it. I think we as Christians for centuries have thought roughly that government can be an extended arm of the church, that we can kind of implement Christian morality in American experiment. It was so that America can be a shining city on the hill. And that temptation, which did not occur with the Puritans first, which was there for centuries, I think comes from the marriage of politics and of church that is at odds with the fundamental message of Jesus. I know that in this moment, many are tempted, whether that's in Catholic circles with integralism, whether that's in Protestant circles with dominionism, to think that we can have a large political solution to the cultural issues that we are facing today. I think that is both a mistake in terms of achieving those goals, but in some ways, for me, much more fundamentally, it is going to result in a great disaffection of people, of young people in particular, from the message of the gospel and from the churches. Very often the question is asked, and I'll make a conjecture. The question is often asked, why is it that in America for many, many years, Christianity was relatively vibrant, whereas in Europe it was secularizing and disappearing? And one of the explanations, which I find myself plausible, is that in Europe, church and state were intimately tied together, and the travails of the state were travails of the church, and vice versa. And then church was connected with power that corrupts, power that is often a very difficult concept, and result was kind of disaffection from the church. I think if we move in that direction in this country and marry the two, closer the two come together, the worse it's going to be for the generations to come, and the message of the gospel will be hindered rather than be able to serve as a ferment of cultural transformation. So in that sense, my sense would be we need to emphasize, revitalize churches, communities. We need to start from bottom up. And I would say, maybe that might seem strange for somebody coming from the liberal institution, progressive institution like Yale. We've got to start with our own hearts. I've learned that from my mother. My mother was my first theological teacher. She was a devout woman who prayed every single morning from 8 to 9, and nobody ought to have disturbed her in that hour. That was holy hour for her. It was holy hour for all of us. And my mother would often talk to me about faith. And she said to me, I remember very, very vividly, Miroslav, the most important decision in this world are not taking place in the capitals, not in Moscow, not in Washington. The most important decisions are being made, and then she has this characteristic gesture, they're being made right here. And here, and rest her finger on her chest to make that point. And I think that is exactly right. We need support of larger groups of people, from friendship churches to cultural settings, in order to be able to thrive. But I think we need to rediscover the beauty and the challenge of the interior life and have this fundamental, unshakable commitment to the values which are the foundation of light, the foundation of the world. Who is God? God is love. What created this world? Expression of God's love. What is the world? World is a gift to us. Why did God create the world? So that it would become home for God and for all people that God has created. Now, that is an interior, that is a story, Christian story, true story, I think. But it's also something that happens within the soul of each one of us. You can't have a home unless you feel at home. And you can't feel at home until home kind of becomes your own thing. You can't be at home if there is a violence in your home. Therefore, you have to have stability, social stability. You can't be at home if materially it's not in some ways home-like around you. So you have to take care of that as well. But essential to home and driver of everything is the sense of my belonging to myself and being there at home. Translated in our language, it means soul as a home of God who is making the world in God's home, into God's home.
There is a fine line between the prophetic and the pathetic.
What was it that I said right now?
No, not you. Not you, my friend. You are prophetic.
Something tricky.
No, I'm leaving. You are prophetic.
I love you, my friend.
You are prophetic. Well, we live in pathetic times to a great degree. The darkness is just the exacerbated darkness. And not to differ, I think we would be on the same sort of meta plane here. I don't want the church, the idea of establishing a theocracy, you're going to have to wait for that. This is not that. If you really want utopia, stick around with your eschatology and see what happens at the end of the day. But we do have a role. From Genesis to Revelation, there were prophetic voices in very pathetic times. And these prophetic voices would address issues of public policy and government and governance. And I do believe the church, I don't want the church to somehow engage in some sort of self-preservation model where all we do is engage in that 1970s, 80s Hal Lindsey escapism mindset. At the same time, the idea of dominionism where, we're going to establish the kingdom of heaven right here, right now, in every sphere of influence perfectly. And when we rule, then Jesus will come. Both of them are out of alignment with biblical truth. What we do need to do is Matthew 5:14 through 16. You are the light of the world. And a city on a hill cannot be hidden. It is our job not to ask God to shine the light. It is our job to be the light. Be the light. John chapter 1, verse 5. Light always overcomes darkness. Our assignment right now in this pathetic age is to be the light. Hence, it's the church, it's the academy, it's the institutions, it's families producing cultural reformers and societal architects that shine the light in every sphere of influence. Not for the sake of establishing a theocracy, but for the sake of advancing the gospel of Jesus. What worries me is religious liberty. If we don't get involved I've had, by the grace of God, the privilege of advising 3 different presidents. President Bush, President Obama for 8 years, and President Trump. And I didn't have to vote for them to advise them. I did not. I remember when President Obama, when the marriage decision came down from the Supreme Court, the number one artifact I have from my grandkids is from the Obama White House commending me on how immediately when the decision came down, I wrote an op-ed piece that either came out of the Wall Street Journal or Fox, one of the two. And it was a strong repudiation of the Obama administration's advancement of a narrative that went counter to our biblical worldview. But I did it in such a nuanced and whimsical and loving way that the letter I got from the White House is, Pastor Sam, thank you for being so vehemently opposed to what we are doing. But you did it in such a loving way that it truly reflects what we believe is correct Christianity. We can do this. But again, it's about turning on the light in the midst of darkness, and there are issues of religious liberty that are at stake. I think every Christian should be involved. I think Christians should run for political office, but not for the purpose of establishing a theocracy, but for, once again, occupying space to turn on the light and repudiate darkness. Listen, folks, I'm the only one here from California. I come from Cuckoo for Cocoa. I mean, I literally live in Cuckoo for Cocoa Puff land. So this is not Yale, it's not Connecticut, and it's not even the Bronx. I'm in California. and because the church in California is to a great degree complacent or quiet, it's the reason why there are some laws that you're going like, are you kidding me? It's a comedy sketch, but it isn't. It's the real world. So it's a healthy balance. And that's, I think, that center of the cross, where the optics of redemption meet the metrics of reconciliation, where the fishers meet the bread, that's the strongest part of the cross. That's where we should reside and operate from.
Just a footnote on this. My saying for what you have summarized, stated so well and so persuasively is political engagement, but not political religion.
Agreed. With a strong amen.
So it's that distinction that has to be kept. Otherwise, you kind of lose the distinction between the realms.
And what seems to be happening is that the religious persuasion is actually not religious. For a lot of the young people, especially on college campuses, sort of woke ideology has almost become a religion. It has replaced the spiritual center. And when I visit college campuses, it's amazing how the lack of, you called, I think, a moral stranger. That is what's happening, but that void is being filled by ideologies, particularly progressive left. I mean, there's talk about family. Nicole Hannah-Jones, who many of you may know, is a writer or lead author for something called the New York Times 1619 Project, whose entire ideology is a victimhood narrative. And she says, for example, as relates to the racial wealth gap in our country, she says to black people, it doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter if you get married, doesn't matter if you buy a home, doesn't matter if you get educated, doesn't matter if you save, none of these things can make up for 400 years of racialized plundering, in her view. It robs, and there's of course no mention of the power of faith or any, and by the way, in her own life, she has done all of these things to be successful and lead a flourishing life. And so the one danger we face from a church perspective, we have to have the courage to face that narrative, where we've got institutions like the New York Times and the entertainment industry who are pushing a narrative which is very anti-religious and putting us in all sorts of racist and other categories. And what I find often in the church is that we're not exercising our moral authority to combat some of these narratives. So while we don't want to establish a theocracy, I agree, I think there are too many missed opportunities where the voice of the church could be so powerful against the narratives that are really diminishing our own children's sense of agency.
I want to ask you all to comment on the virtues we need the kind of virtue we need, the kind of character strengths we need to advance winsomely a biblical worldview of flourishing. In all of your writings, you speak about moral courage of some kind. So I want to ask each of you to comment on what are those virtues, those character strengths. How do we cultivate those in our areas and spheres of influence? Because it seems to me that those are tremendously important to shine the light.
To be the light.
To be the light, to be influential, we have to have these virtues. And one more, if you could comment on how do we educate, engage those around us to learn to love what is good, to desire what is good, to desire real flourishing. You know, we become what we desire, right? That which we love, we become. So how do we educate toward that kind of love, that kind of discernment, those kind of character virtues?
I think for myself, that there are these hard and important virtues. You mentioned truthfulness, love, justice, righteousness, and combination of those two, and I think those are courage. Those seem to me really fundamental. But let's assume that we agree on those. My question is then, in what mode should I be truthful? You talked about op-ed that you wrote, which was written winsomely, right? There's a certain humility that's necessary also. It seems to me it's certainly a virtue, Christian virtue, in terms of what I can and how I can understand myself, how I can walk in the world. You know, it's a feature of, I come from a very small country. And when I encounter big countries, and live in big countries, I kind of live in a different world. And reason why I feel like I live in a different world is that big countries walk like John Wayne through the middle of the street in town. I'm the big shot. I walk. I don't care about who little folks are. This is my street, and whoever is in my way, I mean, they'll find their way out of my way. Otherwise, I'll take them out of my way. But there's a kind of way of being in the world that is just such. And it strikes me, and it seems to me, that is fundamentally at odds with the character of the gospel. A kind of sense that I can have, for instance, an empathy. You mentioned also in our private conversation, which I thought was really, really significant. Can I think myself into the shoes of that person? Can I inhabit that world? It is so easy to dismiss others, to demonize others. But how do I manage even the one who is seemingly my enemy, the one who is opposed to me? How can I step into their shoes as well? How can I see the world from their perspective? How can I see that I have a life in the imagination of other people and take account of that life that I lead in imagination of other people? I think if we lack that ability, we will not be able to live together. I mean, we talked also during the break that the polarities in this country are absolutely staggering. Sight of being able to inhabit the world of others while not betraying one's own conviction. And I think the healing for our nation, and by the way, it's not our nation. I mean, we live in the age globally of hardened identities. And our world suffers tremendously right now globally under the pressure of hardened identities. For God's sake, what we shouldn't do is harden even more those identities. We need to find ways in which we can see each other from perspective with the eyes of the other and try to walk together, notwithstanding the profound differences that we might have. Otherwise, we're going to have little Ukraines happening. We're going to have other events of this sort happening. Last comment I will make. 25 years ago, I wrote a book called Exclusion and Embrace. And it was a conflict around hard national ethnic identities. People in Europe at that time, Europe was uniting, and people in Europe were saying, what are you barbarians there in the Balkans doing? You're at each other's throats while we are all uniting. We, the civilized Europeans, we are uniting, and you, barbarian Balkanists, you are dividing. You're hardening your identities. We live now in a world that is worse in terms of hardening of identities than it was in the Balkan War at the time of the war in former Yugoslavia. And I think we need to find a Christian way beyond hardening of identity. And that means grace, and that means emphasizing we are all God's creatures. And I, above all, ought to love my enemies.
Mr. Sam.
Integrity. You're asking about the virtues that will enable us to advance the agenda of human flourishing in the name of Jesus. Integrity. When your integrity is greater than your influence, nothing can stop you. Integrity is everything. It's authenticity. It's being transparent. There are generations emerging looking for the real, not for the fake, not for the filter, but authenticity and transparency, integrity. Say what you mean what you say, live it out. Don't just preach it. It's not your public image, it's not your posting on Instagram. It's who you are. It's who you are behind the scenes. Integrity is everything. Civility. The fact that the church, as Christians, we can occupy the public sphere with the voice of civility. We should be the primary conduit for reconciliation. We should be. But on many occasions, unfortunately, we have fallen short, and we exacerbate the great divide by being so vociferous and so emotionally driven by the hype and the energy of the moment, even by righteous indignation that becomes carnal oppression, because we permit that to morph into something that's not in alignment with the heart of God. So it's integrity, it's civility, and it's this commitment of making those that follow us greater than ourselves. It's humility. Knowing that it's all by the grace of God, 1 Corinthians 15:10. It's all for his glory, 1 Corinthians 10:31. It's all in his name, Colossians 3:17. It's all about him. It really is. And that's humility is the wineskin that manages the favor of God. And if we do things with integrity and civility and humility, we can literally change the world.
Amen.
Ian.
And speaking of the virtues, again, we've organized our entire school around courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom, with courage being the first, and we believe the most important, because it's courage that must be evoked when all of the other virtues are under attack. And the thing that we think about a lot is, how do we cultivate this virtue? How do you teach? And one of the things that we're doing is, how do we connect our kids' stories today to people generations ago that faced a whole set of different challenges? So, for example, Booker T. Washington, 100 plus years ago, during Jim Crow segregation, where the education for black children, particularly in the South, was horrific. And he said, this is not a vision that I want to preserve. I want to build a network. And he built nearly 5,000 schools throughout the South with Julius Rosenwald. They're considered the Rosenwald schools, of exceptional schools for black children. He was not satisfied with what he faced. And we tell these stories to our kids. And when he founded Tuskegee University, he started a series of lectures every Sunday night, short lectures, 5 to 10 minutes, about courage, integrity. How do you build these characteristics, even during this era of segregation and Jim Crow devastation to the black community? We've gotten those lectures, and now we are doing sessions with our students every month where we recite those lectures verbatim. The words don't have to change. And so we say to our students, if he could recite these things then, under the conditions in which he faced, what will it take for us to surpass the conditions that you face? And we found the more that we tell those kinds of stories across generations, we can start to cultivate the kind of courage that I think our kids need today.
We're almost out of time, so I want to ask a question for us to engage, which is the role of the family. A central institution. In your book, you made a wonderful, wonderful case for the importance of the family and how often it's being neglected in today's conversations about flourishing. We focus on race, ethnicity, other demographics, LGBTQ issues, freedom, unhampered freedom at times as views of flourishing, yet family, from a sociological standpoint, has been demonstrated to be one of the strongest and most important institutions for flourishing. And yet, even within the church, families are struggling in significant ways. So in your experience, your research in terms of flourishing in the church, outside of the church, share with us your thoughts on the family now, what we need to do as families in a very personal way, and what we need to do in the context and culture in which we live to protect families.
Well, virtually every social pathology that we are concerned with, crime, poor education, poor health outcomes, mass incarceration rates, if you reverse integrate back to a lot of the issues that were the springwell for why these things are happening, often you see a deep correlation, if not causation, to lack of strong families, particularly single-parent homes. And that what I spoke about earlier with the Who's Your Daddy truck, the non-marital birth rate in that section of the Bronx was 85%. And when I started doing this research in Chicago and parts of Los Angeles, in Appalachia, you see, particularly amongst women 24 and under, in 2020, the non-marital birth rate for women 24 and under in the Black community was 91%. 71% across all races, so it's 61% in the white community. It's what I call the equal opportunity tsunami. And yet, how often are we talking about family and the importance of family structure as the central most important factor that's driving a host of these outcomes? Many of you may have seen the data that was just released in the nation's report card, the National Assessment for Educational Progress. Huge declines in academic outcomes in almost every state. And you're seeing, what about the racial achievement gap? All these other things. It turns out, and I'm hoping to publish this soon, based on looking at the data, kids living with their married mother and father are doing at least twice as well, of every other potential family structure. But where are you seeing that as the actual lever that has the greatest potential, in addition to faith, to transform outcomes for young people? So I'm on a mission at our schools. We are committed to this idea of teaching our students about strong family formation. There's something called the success sequence that I write about in my book. If you finish just your high school degree, get a full-time job of any kind, just you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if you have children, if you get married first, 97% of people who follow that series of decisions avoid poverty. It's not a guarantee, but this is information young people need to know, and there are many people who actually oppose the teaching of this content. You can't teach that. These kids are coming from broken families, so let's not teach this kind of content, because somehow you'll shame them for growing up in families that haven't followed this success sequence. Those are the gatekeepers who have appointed themselves to be acting in the interests of these communities, when in fact they're depriving our very young people of the very information that's so crucial, particularly around family formation. For me, it's one of the central reasons I'm running schools, for young people to understand this element, The family that they form, not the family that they're from, will be the single greatest decision that they make in their lives.
Yeah, I want to make just almost two little additions, not so much to take anything away. One is the studies that I've read, especially about immigrant families. All of us are immigrant, and what happens in the second generation after immigrant family. There is a, and the reason for it, because there is a significant downturn that happens in the second generation. And whereas you had in the settings from which they came, they have aunts and uncles and wider network of very thick relationship that when parents could not catch a person, a child, aunt did, and so it was seen as we belong in this thick network of relationship together. We're going to take care of one another, and that kind of relieves the pressure on the single family, which I know many of us experience those pressures, have difficulties in relationships. The other side of things, and I can't help but thinking about it very frequently. I mean, Jesus was single. I mean, Apostle Paul was single. I mean, the call was away from of the family. There was something also that is fundamentally about a kind of sense of more ultimate devotion than the family. It's not that somehow God is subservient to family. To the contrary, you might have to sacrifice family for the sake of devotion to God. I think that is so central to the message of Jesus. I'm not sure that it takes away anything of the importance of the thick relationship. That was the point earlier that I made. But it's a very important to keep in mind, and therefore not to overburden those who choose this kind of way, because for whatever reason they might not be able to live otherwise.
Pastor Sam.
As for me and my house, we shall serve the Lord. Joshua's declaration. You fast forward to Acts 16:31. Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you and your family, you and your household will be saved. 23 generations deep, Isaac digs up the well that his father dug up that was clogged up by the enemies, or in California, we would call them the mucho malo hombres. They would dig up the well. 23 generations deep. 23 generations deep. There is a multi-generational family promise embedded in Scripture if we get things right. If we pursue righteousness in the New Testament, if we live in the finished work of Christ. So there's a commitment for the family. We need to re-strengthen. Churches need to become family-oriented. Right now, we're more about production and content, even sermonettes, what we present. And we need to be focused more on the next generation and families. How do we strengthen families? How do we deal with mental health issues? How do we deal with anxiety and fear and depression and abuse? How do we deal with pornography addiction in the church? How do we deal with so many issues that are confronting families today, even post-COVID? How do we do that? So it requires the church to really step up. We need to go beyond Sunday's kumbaya service and become an integral force in transforming and building a firewall for families to be more viable. Last thing, the Apostle Paul's writings, to a great degree. God conquers, we possess, our children inherit.
Cornerstone University students, some high school, some middle school students, what would you say to them as they think about the future, they see all that's happening around them about God, the Bible, and human flourishing? Pastor Sam.
Yeah, listen, simply stated, we're living in the last days, and there is a long, very exhaustive list in Timothy, Matthew 25, even Romans chapter 1. We're living in the last days. We are. In the last days, people will become lovers of themselves. We call that Instagram. In the last days, men and women will leave their natural desires. We call that California. But there is a great last day promise. I kid you not. It's so promising that it's embedded both in the Old Testament and New. Joel 2:28, Acts 2:17. In the last days, God says this: not I might, not I may, not I'm inclined to, not I hope to. I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. So get ready. We're about to see God's glory show up like we've never seen before.
Amen. 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 Dr. Wolf.
I long for what would Jesus do days. You didn't hear it from theologian, right? We were always critical of that. What would Jesus do? That's too simple. You don't live in Jesus' time. But it contains a profound truth. Jesus of the gospel is the key to our humanity. And what Jesus would do today is the most important question we can ask of ourselves. And on the answer to that question, and the blessing of the Spirit of God upon all flesh depends where we as individuals, where we as churches, where we as culture are going to be.
Thank you. Amen.
And I think the message I would say to students here, to the same students that are in our own classrooms, courage. We are living at a time where there are ideas, narratives, men can get pregnant, the family doesn't matter. These ideologies are corrosive and dangerous, and yet many of us, when we hear these things, are silent and fearful. Don't let that happen. Courage is what we need as individuals. Courage is what we need as a society. Courage is what we need in our church to combat these narratives that are harming our children. Courage, courage, courage.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists? Thank you. Thank you.